Right.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, and in a way, it's so interesting because we've been spending our money dealing with what they've now euphemistically called legacy assets.
Mm-hmm.
They used to first call them toxic waste, toxic assets, then they called them troubled assets, now the official term is legacy assets. But that's backward looking. And it hasn't...
Why is that backward looking?
Because it's looking at the loans that were made in the past.
As long as those loans are there, those assets are there, those toxic assets are there, these banks have a very bad balance sheet.
Yes, but there's another way of dealing with that
which
problem,
which is to
convert the debt into equity.
Right.
No one knows how to value those risky assets,
right.
and what they're doing is very simple. They want to take all that trash and dump it on the U.S. taxpayer, and it doesn't make it disappear.
Well, the original idea, we buy all the toxic assets.
That's right.
Under the Paulson plan.
Exactly. And then they went into buying it in bulk, and then the current program is to use the private sector as the garbage collector and dump it on our backs. But it's all basically the same idea.
From the beginning, the toxic assets have been a huge problem. So what should we do about them now?
I just think there's a fundamental debate going on here
Exactly.
about valuation, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but there's certainly a countervailing view to what you were saying, that indeed these toxic assets can be marked, and they should be marked lower at where the banks think they should be, and that's why the banks don't want to sell them.
But that raises the question, if they do that, what will that mean to the balance sheet of the banks if they have to mark them lower? And how many banks will we find are, in fact, at that valuation insolvent?
Probably quite a few, which is the scary aspect.
So what do you do then?
And that's why you need to convert the debt into equity. So, in fact, it's the only way that you can do it. If it turns out, then, that the banks are right and the toxic assets are worth a lot more, then the equity of the banks will go up automatically and they get fully compensated. So the issue here is who's going to bear the risk of the uncertain valuation? And is it the people who gave the money to the bank, or is it the U.S. taxpayer? And it's really as simple as that.
Andrew.
This all points, though, to the issue of confidence and what the goal of the stress test was supposed to do, which was supposed to be to instill confidence. We were supposed to have the stress test, we were supposed to get the results, and we were supposed to say, this is all going to work out.
Meaning they had enough capital to do what they
had enough capital, or we knew which ones were in trouble and which ones weren't, and we were all supposed to feel very good about it. Instead, what I worry about now is that we're going to look at the results of the stress test, and it's almost a lose-lose. Either you're going to be very realistic, perhaps even too realistic for many people, and you're going to suggest that some of these banks really are either insolvent or in so much trouble that they're going to need either additional tax dollars beyond, by the way, taking preferred shares and swapping them for common, or you're going to decide, bonds
into equity,
or you're going to decide that the entire process is a whitewash, and you're going to have no confidence in the test to begin with.
I think you're right about that quandary, because initially I think people were excited about getting real results. Then the word leaked out that nobody was going to fail the stress test. Everybody was more or less in good shape. Right. And then the public reaction was, well, are these stress tests worth the paper they're written on?
And what is their methodology?
How could that be? How can this is just going to hurt confidence?
And you look at the numbers that they've come out, and they certainly are not the worst numbers that one could imagine. I mean, they're sort of median. But stress is stress. It's not where the average is.
Right.
It's what happens if...
I mean, they are thinking worst case is unemployment at 10.3%. Housing prices are down.
You mean
the government?
These were the assumptions?
The assumptions built into the stress test assume three major things. One, that unemployment's at 10.3%.
Right. In the worst case scenario.
In the worst case scenario.
Right.
And by the way, that's...
8.8 is the baseline.
So this is median already in some cases. Unemployment's at 10.3. We go house prices at 22%. Thank you. I apologize. And finally, that the economy contracts by 3.3%.
Yeah.
All of those are right down the middle. Nobody would argue, I think, that is true stress. Worst case scenario.
What would true stress be?
Probably 11 or 12%
unemployment.
Absolutely.
Make an analogy I think will help understand this. Think of a bridge that a truck had driven over. The bridge collapses, the truck falls down, kills 1,000 people who happen to be walking under the bridge. When something like that happens, when they go to rebuild the bridge, that bridge had a 10,000-pound capacity. The truck weighed 9,800 pounds, but stress and otherwise the bridge collapsed. Before people can get comfortable crossing that bridge again, What you do is you make the bridge have a 40,000 pound capacity, knowing that trucks of 10,000 pounds are only going to travel over, just to create an enormous margin of safety.
Right.
What doesn't work is to do a stress test, which is not the extreme stress, and say that a bunch of banks have passed. What you need to do is, we don't need well-capitalized banks under a historic definition. What we need is extraordinarily well-capitalized banks. And you have to ask yourself, what is the downside if the U.S. banking system was the best capitalized banking system in the world? So imagine a world, again, using this debt for equity. The beauty of converting debt for equity is it's not a taking from the taxpayer, and it's not a taking from the bondholder. The bondholder is getting exactly what they own, right? A bondholder is an owner of a company in the same way an equity investor. The equity investor is a residual owner.
Except that most bondholders don't want to do this.
Right, exactly.
Okay, but why not? Most shareholders don't want their stock to go down.
Yeah, right? Exactly. But there's a difference. I mean, clearly they don't want to go down, but bondholders don't want to do this, and they have an option.
Right. They don't have an option, and here's why. Okay, and the thing we haven't been talking about, and I think the public is focused only on the taxpayer equity that's gone into banks, but actually the FDIC is guaranteeing enormous billions, tens of billions, the number could be 100 plus at this point, of bank bonds that are coming due. The ultimate test as to whether our banks can survive going forward is, can they stand on their own 2 feet? Can they raise capital on their own? And the FDIC, I think the major banks in the country have something like $300 billion worth of debt. This is the holding company and subsidiary debt coming due in 2009, about $280 billion in 2010, another $250 billion in 2011. And as that debt comes due, it's being paid off with new bond issues that are guaranteed by the FDIC. No private sector person is willing to take the risk of investing in a bank. So what we need to do is we need to build the 40,000-pound bank. Okay, the bank that can withstand the stress of 4 trucks driving over the bridge, even though 1 is only allowed.
Suppose that doesn't happen because of the bondholders. What's the alternative?
The alternative is we have more AIGs.
Basically, the global financial system is so deeply intertwined that it scares the bejesus out of people to think about letting a major insurer, a major bank fail, because they have trades on, sometimes with a maturity of 30 years, with hundreds, if not thousands, of different counterparties, and they need to make good on their obligations.
But these proposals are not to let the banks fail, and that goes back to the point I said.
These proposals will ensure that banks don't fail as much as you can.
Exactly. Right. So it's the confusion is too big to fail or too big to be financially restructured. And there has been no argument that they're too big to be financially restructured.
Okay, I have a question about Citi and Bank of America after you make your point.
I want to distinguish, and it's a very important distinction, between a holding company, which is a shell, and a bank, which collects deposits, enters into derivative transactions. I believe a bank of the scale of a Citibank, not Citigroup, but a bank of the scale of Citibank, is a systemically important institution.
Citigroup being the holding company.
Being the holding company. So I think it's very important that when you go through a process like this, number one, the government has to say we're going to guarantee deposits. The government's going to have to say we're going to guarantee derivative transactions. The government's going to have to say for the subsidiary that we're going to guarantee the loan commitments. They then, over the weekend, do a restructuring of the holding company. The depositors are fine. You convert debt into equity. Now you've got a solvent bank. So the government's commitment is it's only a temporary commitment, because once you have an overly capitalized institution, you don't need a deposit guarantee beyond what we have now.
Once you get a clean bank,
that's right,
the private sector will come in.
Bank of America and Citibank, how much trouble are they in?
Well, Ken Lewis would like to say there's a huge distinction between Bank of America and Citigroup, and I'm sure Vikram would like to say that they're Vikram Panda, the CEO, they would say that there's a distinction between Bank of America. I think Citigroup is clearly going to be on of the 19 banks. I would imagine that Citigroup is going to be under more stress than others, and therefore is going to need capital one way or another. How we get there, whether it's Bill's plan or others, we don't know. Bank of America, in an odd way, is more interesting, because Ken Lewis has been very outspoken about the fact that not only does he not need the money, he wants to give back his TARP money. He has really staked his his reputation in the past several weeks on the fact that his bank is stronger than people think. And
he's also created headlines by saying that they told him not to talk about Merrill Lynch.
Absolutely. He has come out and said that he was directed by Hank Paulson that not only that he needed to accept the deal with Merrill and not disclose the problems that he thought were going on there. But the issue is, if, in fact, Bank of America comes out with a failing grade or a grade that requires him to get additional capital, what that does to his reputation and, frankly, what that does to his legacy and longevity in that job. And I think that, to me, over the next several weeks will be the big question mark.